From a civil society perspective, first of all, we have to realize that the migration and trafficking are two different things. Migration is not for the purpose of exploitation, and trafficking is always for the purpose of exploitation. Migration involves movement. Trafficking may or may not involve movement. And what do I mean by that? A migrant will have to move from, say, Calcutta to Delhi, Delhi to New York. A person who is trafficked may be born in a situation of exploitation to a trafficked person already. So a girl born in a brothel to a prostituted mother is considered trafficked because she's harbored for the purpose of exploitation and put into prostitution herself. The same thing with a farm worker who's kept in bondage and a child born to the farm worker is also exploited. That child is considered trafficked. So we have to be able to distinguish between migration and trafficking to decide what kind of policies we have to implement and what are the vulnerabilities to migration and trafficking. Sometimes there is an overlap because poverty, of course, is a factor when people choose to migrate. And poverty also is a factor when they are preyed upon by traffickers, by pimps, by recruiters, by transporters. But also there are other factors which are different in the case of migration and different in the case of trafficking. For example, a vulnerability in migration could be conflict, natural disaster, and the aspiration for a better life. In trafficking, it's not the aspiration for a better life. It's a survival strategy. And therefore, the vulnerabilities also differ. Lack of choices are contextual, both in trafficking and migration. So when a person is choosing a better life, the kind of choices a potential migrant has is very different from the kind of choices that a trafficked person can or cannot envisage. They are at the end of their choices, where a migrant is potentially thinking about increasing their choices. And this is a very, very big difference. In a place like India or Asia, where Susu and I both come from, we have seen that there have been huge amounts of labor migration, looking for better jobs, looking for better opportunities, sometimes just looking for better infrastructure, where a city has housing and houses are swept away in a flood, in a tsunami or something in their part of the world. So those are the vulnerabilities which can create a migration. Whereas for a trafficked person, what happens is that they could be devalued as girls, they could have no jobs, they might be an organized criminal network in the very area where they are, who tell them that between starvation and a bed in a brothel or a room as a domestic worker somewhere, maybe they might like to choose that. So this vulnerability is exploited differently.
Thank you. Well, I really like the initial definition. At first, understanding the difference between what it means to smuggle and traffic. That has been a very big issue from Delta's perspective and certainly from the private sector. First, the general awareness and defining what the terms are. The difference to understand, are they being smuggled? Are they being trafficked? And for us, it was a huge undertaking, and we'll get into this a little bit more, as the first and only airline to sign onto the ECPAC code. Some of the initial response was, well, why are we getting involved in the first place? Are we engaged in trafficking or are we engaged in smuggling? And so for us, our vulnerabilities were probably some of our own people understanding what the issue is. And you referenced what happens in other countries. Well, our issues were what were happening in our own backyard as it relates to the trafficking. And so those were some of the misnomers and some of the issues that we are yet beginning to teach our employees, our customers, and our vendors. And over the last several months, we've done some tremendous work. And those are just, again, much closer to home. We're not even looking outside of America at this point because we know that there are some issues that we need to deal with just here in America alone. And we'll certainly talk a little bit more about that as we go through.
I think that one of the things that we see, and this is reflected in the annual Trafficking in Persons report, which, just so folks are familiar with it, we look at each of the government's efforts around the world. So we're looking at, this year, 185 countries around the world, and what is the government in each of those doing to fight against human trafficking, as defined in a manner consistent with what Ruchira said, that this notion of, well, we'll go one up and go to Barack Obama, as he said last week, it's just pure and simple slavery. When you think about human trafficking as all of the activities involved in reducing someone to or holding them in a condition of compelled service, you then can capture that notion of the person who's born into it, the person who's doing it in their hometown, or the person who's vulnerable to it because they've traveled halfway around the world. And you realize that migration or movement is not a prerequisite to decide that somebody's been a trafficking victim. But we see, and we have seen time and time and time again, that the migrants are often the most vulnerable people. Now, I think that there's a trope out there of the kidnapped girl, usually a kidnapped white girl who's being sold often by Arab men or black men or things like this. This is a trope around human trafficking that's been in the culture since the late 1800s. The movie Taken, which is a great movie, don't get me wrong, but it was very much the same kind of stories were being told in plays in the 1880s that were very much about the morality of white women. Fast forward to now, what we're really dealing with isn't necessarily people being kidnapped off the street. It's people who are vulnerable, whether it's because they're in a particular ethnic group that is preyed upon in their own area, whether it's through colonization, whether it's caste, whether it's hereditary slavery, whatever you want to call these things. It's a group that's been made vulnerable, maybe en masse getting kidnapped and moved the way that African Americans historically in the United States, or it's people who have become vulnerable often through migration. And I think that that's the thing, you know, we always have that vision of the guy who's driving my taxi here in New York was a physicist back home. Well, part of the reason why he's driving a taxi is because he doesn't have the same access to information, he doesn't have the same access to the job market, he doesn't have the same access to society now that he's here in New York as he did back home. If your entry point into that migration experience, the differentiation of information, if your entry point is someone who has your best interests at heart, you're having a good transaction with them to get you to that migration, they get you the job and it turns out that it's a good job, then that's successful migration. I think that that's what we see with, frankly, the bulk of migration in the world. But there is a percentage of failed migration. And I think that what we've seen as we look at the TIP report, as we apply this notion of slavery, look at the vulnerabilities that I described, what we've seen is actually that it's much more this notion of the unscrupulous employer and the unscrupulous labor broker. And the information differential is so great that the person who doesn't think they're a trafficking victim, when they're on that Delta flight from Africa or that Delta flight from Asia now, you know, they don't think they're a trafficking victim. They're still hopeful. They think that they're going to have the better life because so-and-so told them when he came to the village. They don't know that so-and-so is a so-and-so and has sold them a bill of goods. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to flatten out. One of the things that hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about is the President's new executive order on government contracting. And probably one of the most important things in there is the notion of how do we address these labor brokers? How do we change it so the qualification for a migrant to get a job is not their willingness to borrow the money from a loan shark and pay somebody, but their qualification for doing that job is actually because they're good at that job and need to be able to travel. So I think it's changing the information dynamic and erasing those vulnerabilities so that we can have successful migration. It doesn't mean the trafficking is going to stop because there's other vulnerabilities as well, but at least we can try to make sure that the migration experience is a much cleaner, above board, and fair one.